This is a Willets Point Shea Stadium bound 7 express train. The next and last stop is Willets Point Shea Stadium.
Oh, yes, it is the Subway To Shea Podcast. Anthony Rivera here with you, talking about all the news and happenings surrounding that team from Queens, the New York Mets. You can follow the show on Twitter at Subway To Shea. Listen and subscribe to the show on Anchor.fm, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Radio Public, Breaker, and Pocket Cast. Turn on notifications to never miss an episode of Subway To Shea. You can also find Subway To Shea on YouTube. This podcast is available on the HSP Network. Catch me alongside podcasts like The Bullpen with DA, The Third Floor Lounge, which covers the NFL and NBA, Sus Talk, and the return of the High Spot Podcast, which covers all things professional wrestling. Just search High Spot Podcast on YouTube or youtube.com/High Spot Podcast and make sure to subscribe today. If you can also do me a favor, please take a few minutes to write me a review and let me know what you think of the show, what you like, what you don't like. I want to know both. I want to make this show better each and every week for you Met fans out there. So do me a favor, rate the show, leave me a review. You can do that on Apple Podcasts. The better the rating, the higher my podcast gets out there, the more listeners it gets to out there. So rate, review the show, and joining me now on the Subway To Shea Podcast is Mike Silva, host of the Talkin' Mets podcast. That's Talkin' with no G. So when you go on to check it out, make sure you put Talkin' with a no G. Talkin' Mets podcast. Mike, how you doing, buddy?
Thank you. Great introduction. That's my Long Islandese, Brooklynese, Talkin' with no G. You know, we like to eat. New Yorkers like to chew their words, and I guess I did that in the title. But Anthony, thanks for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, Mike, we have a lot to talk about, from the media coverage of the Rally Ratcoon to Donnie Stevenson and Chili Davis, the whole firing saga. But let's get down to the big news that happened on Monday, and that is Jacob deGrom heading to the injured list. Now, I have the quote that the Mets released, and it says, results from the MRI taken on Jacob deGrom last night were clean of any issues. However, the Mets intend to place deGrom on the injured list tomorrow, retroactive to May 10th, with right side tightness, and will announce a corresponding move at that time. What are your thoughts on the move by the Mets doing this?
Well, it's the best case scenario, and I was talking about this on the last show, that, you know, all the good that, you know, despite all the craziness and the offense being what it is, and really at times not the greatest start, and there's been some wins that even though they've won, you haven't felt good about some of the execution, again, specifically on the offense, but the pitching has been so good. But part of that is that you have guys like deGrom and Stroman pitching like top of the rotation guys, and they're getting you to the, you know, 6th, 7th inning. The minute you lose your ace, that changes the whole equation. And now you have a bullpen that's going to be taxed more. You're not going to get that guaranteed high level start every 5 days. So the fact that he'll be out, let's say 2 weeks, let's say through the road trip, let's think positively. This is the best news possible. I was under no delusion that he was going to not go on the D. It'd be foolish to take not to be cautious now. And, you got to believe when they say that they're, I know there was some media members like Buster Olney was saying that's a bit of a contradiction. Look, he's tight. He's hurting himself. And if he's tight, just because there's nothing wrong doesn't mean he's not sore. And when you're sore, you make adjustments to your mechanics. And guess what? Adjustments in mechanics can lead to elbow issues, shoulder issues. All it takes is one pitch that you execute in a compromised manner and something else crops up. So why take the chance now? It's early in the season. They should be able to navigate a couple of weeks. And, before you know it, in 3-4 weeks, they're going to have reinforcements. You'll have Syndergaard back. You'll have Carrasco back. Hopefully Syndergaard will be back healthy. So you're not looking for a long period of time. And they right now have done a good job bringing in depth pieces that may not be great in terms of who they are individually, but the downgrade from the starters and their normal players to these guys is not the same downgrade that you're typically used to with the Mets in prior years. So they're in a pretty good position, I think, right now.
Yeah, I think it's a smart move, especially with the time time frame that we have and all the days that are off for them, they'll be able to skip a spot in the rotation. This gives deGrom, like you said, time to rest so he could be 100%. I'd rather have him miss 1 or 2 starts than a long amount of time. And it also gives them the flexibility to bring up another arm. We know in the past that they've been undermanned, especially, in the beginning of the season when they didn't want to put Nimmo on the DL or they didn't want to put Davis and they were undermanned on the bench. So this is a good opportunity for deGrom to get rested, for them to bring up another arm. And I think, if I'm correct, Noah Syndergaard went through this injury a couple of years ago and he kind of missed most of the season.
Right. I mean, lats are serious. They're a soft muscle tear. Now, Noah, if I remember correctly, had a partial tear. Steven Matz, going back to 2015 when he first came up, if you look back, he had a strain. He was out from like the middle of July, the All-Star break, to the middle of September. You have to treat it very carefully because, I mean, look, that's your side. That's, where you push off potentially, depending on where it is. And it's like anything else. You have a pain in your side or your back, it's going to compromise your mechanics. Your compromised mechanics will lead to 2 things. 1, you won't be as effective. And then 2, you're going to hurt another part of your body. Everything is connected when you're a pitcher. The Mets, in the past might be hesitant to put deGrom on the injured list because, well, what are the optics? It'll lead to the speculation that they're hiding an injury. Now they're basically saying, look, you want to believe him, you don't want to believe him, that's up to you. This is a precautionary measure, and we're giving him a rest to get it worked out, and we don't care what you think. And also, you don't want to play shorthanded because in the past they wouldn't put him on the DL for PR reasons, and now you're playing with a short bench, or it didn't make any sense. So they're functioning much better from a standpoint where they're making moves for the right reasons. And again, this is the best case scenario that you could have gotten. There was no other scenario better than this. I did not think you were going to get a report saying, all right, he'll be starting in 5 days. You knew they were going to take a cautious route.
Now, how all this came about, deGrom had missed a start last week with the right lat inflammation, came back Sunday against the Diamondbacks, pitched 5 innings, 1 hit, 1 run, but he just didn't look right. I saw him wince a couple of times. You could see him touch his side, touch his back. Were you okay with the decision for him to even go against the Diamondbacks on Sunday?
I think you leave it up to the player. I'm all for players grinding through injuries. Players know their body, and you have to also understand who you're dealing with. There's irresponsible players and players that are going to lie about how they feel, but I don't think he'd go out there unless he felt that he wasn't at risk for further injury. But think about this. We're at a point in his career arc where he doesn't have a good out, and it's 5 innings, 1 run. I think he struck out 5, struck out a batter per inning. That's considered a bad outing. His ERA went up from 0.5 to like 0.6. He wasn't great. There's been some really dominant outings like against Washington, and there's been outings like opening day against the Phillies and yesterday where he hasn't been himself, and he's still dominating. Think about where he's at. Think about that, what we're seeing, that gift that you have in front of you. Very few pitchers in my lifetime can you say this guy was off. And by the way, when you look up, and maybe you saw it like with the Maddoxes and the Smoltz and guys like that where you'd face them and you knew they weren't themselves, but then you'd look up at the scoreboard and they would get, they went 7 innings, 2 runs. And you'd say, damn, when can I get a guy like that? Well, you have one. You have one like that where even in his less than perfect situations, he's able to navigate lineups. I may have got a little lucky with some hard contact, but you know what? In the middle innings of, 3, 4, 5, he was pretty much vintage Jacob deGrom until he got that bases loaded situation. And he cleaned up the mess with minimal damage. You can't ask for more than that.
Now, it just seems like even with this 5-game winning streak, the Mets can't win, especially with the media. And I know you've spoken out against the media coverage of the team on your podcast, and that's one of the main reasons why I wanted to have you on this show today. Let's go over a couple instances that's taken place already this week. Obviously, you mentioned the whole Buster Olney thing, and, I got a little frustrated reading his thing because right off the bat, it's, the team is they're not giving out the information. They're not being complete with what's going on. I mean, it's like they can't win. If they don't put deGrom on the injured list, they'll get blasted for that. If they do it, they get blasted for that as well. What gives with this?
I was listening to another sport. I was listening to the morning show on the NBA radio with Brian Scalabrine and Frank Isola, and they were talking about something similar this morning about how with the Knicks, at the beginning of the year, it was all about, Tom Thibodeau is playing them too many minutes. And now yesterday, Derrick Rose plays 32 minutes and they're, talking to him about, well, are you okay with playing, you're playing great minutes, you're playing starter minutes, but you're coming off the bench. And it's like, well, you can't win. It's either too many minutes, too little minutes. Do you want to play more minutes? And it's a narrative that creates dialogue, and it creates a theme and a story, and it kind of writes yourself. It's unfortunately, whether it be sports, politics, serious stuff in our world, you're seeing that. I think part of that is there's too much content that needs to be filled. So how do you fill it? By manufactured debate. I think some of it is that the people that are in these positions now are not really knowledgeable about the topics in front of them. They're knowledgeable in a myopic way. The Mets for so long have been an easy, and look, they still had tons of crazy stuff happen to them between the off the field scandals, with the management and some of the things that happened in management, to the Trevor Bauer fiasco, to this Ratcoon stuff. I mean, they still got stuff that, all the things that have happened since, let's say, spring training, you couldn't make this stuff up. But it's easier to have your laugh out loud Mets, or your Mets are that team that always shoots itself in the foot, and you want to perpetuate that theme. The other thing is, I think, there's a lot of guys, and there's a lot of good beat reporters. I love Justin Toscano, and Tim Healy does some great work, and then there's also national guys, guys like Kevin Kernan and Mike Vaccaro, I have tons of respect for. But, there's also a lot of guys on that beat that get a kick out of, beating on the team. And, unfortunately, it's been easy in the past because the Mets have kind of allowed it to happen. But I think what you saw this weekend is they had a controversy, which really wasn't, and they used humor to diffuse it. But but management, meaning Luis Rojas and Zach Scott, the lie and cover up, they just said, hey, it's not a big deal in our eyes because it's been solved, and not how we would handle it. But, this is not something that I want to belabor. They didn't add fuel to the fire. And guess what? It got cut off. It's history. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's going to be a change for the media, because that's the kind of stuff that teams like the Yankees and the football giants at one point, they used to stay away from that stuff because they handled it that way. And now hopefully the Mets have turned in the corner, and it's not going to be overnight. Old habits die hard. And let's face it, when you have a job to write a story, getting clicks with drama is always better than writing about the mechanics of, pitching or, a hitter's mechanics, or just writing about baseball. We've gotten away from pure baseball because, unfortunately, pure baseball isn't a sexy headline.
We're going to get into a lot of what's going on the field. But, you mentioned about the whole Ratcoon thing and, the whole, I like to call it the tussle in the tunnel between Lindor and McNeil. Now, I know they've not been in sync on the field a few times and both seem frustrated. And you know what? Maybe they did get into an argument. But again, you have some media members assuming what happened, going as far as to say that Jeff McNeil had a black eye and a bloody lip. I posted a picture on Twitter and he looked perfectly fine to me. Nothing's wrong with him. Mike, the reach just seems so far in trying to write a scathing story on this team. Even going back in time with, Vince Coleman, you got the issues between Keith Hernandez and Darryl Strawberry. Even the media basically running Tom Seaver out of town. Do you agree that this just is very toxic in trying to get these scathing stories against the Mets?
I lived through, and I wasn't around for Seaver. I was born in the late 70s, but Dick Young did that, and that's also a different. During that era, from what I understand, that was also the beginning of free agency, and the divide and the power between the writer and the player was starting to shift. The gap between their salary and the player's salary was starting to shift, and I think a guy like Dick Young didn't like it. He didn't like a player like Seaver dictating the terms. They very much were into the, I would call the reserve clause mindset where, you shut up and play ball and take whatever you give you kind of mindset, which is preposterous considering that you got 700 guys out there thereabouts in a professional baseball team that, only 700 guys are good enough to do that job. That's simple economics, supply and demand. They deserve, that piece of the pie. And I lived through and Bobby Valentine stuff, and those were real. That was drama played out with even the Knicks over the years and the football giants when Jeremy Shockey was around, and Rex Ryan Jets. There's been some real controversy that the teams have put out there and flamed. This was not that, and I think they were trying to see if there was a new player with a big contract with his smile that's coming from Cleveland. Let's see what he's slumping. Let's see what he's got, and they tried to fan the flames. And to me, this all starts, and the advent of Zoom and the Zoom coverage, it's hard to get a full story. See, this is where I feel for the guys covering the team, because there's only so much you can get out of Zoom. It's a beautiful tool. And to remotely work as a beat writer, to have some kind of work-life balance is huge. They don't get paid a ton of money. And they do the travel. In normal times, they do the travel of the players, but they don't get the payment nearly of the players. So you're trying to cover the team remotely, quote-unquote, and this is the perfect story to kind of get you through through, because those little sidebar stories that you're able to go into the corner of a locker room and talk to J.D. Davis or Brandon Nimmo or Sean Reed Foley and get a nice, story on an off day like today. You can't do that right now, because if they're not available to you over Zoom, or you haven't been able to make a personal connection and get their phone number, what are you going to write about? There's only so much game story you can write. So if you manufacture something like this, it keeps on giving. Remember, media is a business, and they're the business of fear and drama, whether it's sports or it's politics. You've seen it play out very much so over the last 15 months on much more serious issues than baseball. Without those fear and all that stuff and drama, it becomes normal, and it becomes somewhat textbook and educational. And then you don't have the broader base of clicks and eyeballs, and eventually, you're going to get a call from the editor saying, what the hell's going on? So, that's always going to happen. It's going to happen tenfold here in New York. You as a player and a team have to be smart enough to know how to diffuse it. And I think the Mets did a pretty good job. And I'll certainly say Lindor and McNeil handled it quite differently than I would. And they got away with it because I think they were basically saying, hey, guys, this is no big deal. Let's make a joke of it. That's the second time the Mets have made a joke out of something. The other time was obviously the Donnie Stevenson moniker.
Do you think that the Zoom is the new era of covering sports now?
I think there's going to be a component of control. Now, does Zoom get replaced with back to the press room with the dais? Possibly. I think... Look, I haven't been in a ton of clubhouses. I've always covered the team from an independent perspective. And my coverage or my whole existence doesn't rely on standing in the locker room waiting for a player's quote and writing game stories. That's not who I am. The only times I've covered, whether it be mainly minor league but a big league club, you're trying to grab somebody, you're trying to get a feature down, you're trying to do something different. But basically, you stand in a locker room in normal times. It's like, you and I are living in our house, and there are these strangers standing in our living room in the middle of it, and they may come talk to me, they may not. They have an hour of access to my house to talk to my family, and they may come up to me, they may not. When they come up to me, I talk to them, and then they leave and they write a story. That's what it is. That's what basically you're doing. So at some point, you're invading their personal space. There's only so many ways you can repackage the same quote. They're being taught not to say a lot because they're afraid of how their words are going to be misconstrued, especially now in the Me Too era and the era of political correctness. Everything can be misconstrued. Not so much about the game of baseball, but when people come up to you in that locker room, don't be fooled. I know for a fact people have asked off-topic things that may not be inappropriate, but they're ways of going down a rabbit hole that could get you in trouble. So I think getting them out of the locker room is going to be the first thing. I think the players don't want them there, and they want less of them in there. And I think controlling the access to the team will provide you A, the team will provide you B. That's where it's going. And that's going to make coverage of the team that much harder because, notice after the game, Anthony, you're not getting a lot of Twitter action. I mean, think about yesterday. Mets win a big game. How much Twitter dialogue was there after the game yesterday? Very little. Look at your timeline. The beat writers aren't giving you anything because they don't have any access. You get the Louis Rojas quote, which, by the way, even if you're independent media like me, I'm subscribed to MLB Press Box. I can get those Zooms on my own. I don't need them.
Right.
The fans can get that on SNY.TV. So really at this point, the team's controlling the message. Think about the Ratcoon. Didn't the Mets not control that message from start to finish?
Oh, yeah.
That was like a Matumbo brick wall. You didn't get past it. Now, it doesn't make us understand this as much. I've heard that, this went back all the way to Chicago. There's been some talk of that, their disagreement. I personally think, why there was a disagreement? I think the shifting has been utterly absurd. I've seen positioning on the field that I don't understand. Again, I'm not privy to the analytics, and I see a second baseman and shortstop going all different ways to their weak side and trying to make the play when, if a second baseman was going to be a shortstop, he'd be a shortstop. And if a shortstop was a second baseman, he'd be a second baseman. I kind of feel that, the shift and the handling that, Lindor's been public about not liking the shift, has played maybe into both of their frustrations. And then guess what? They're taking it out on each other. And you know what? They're new teammates. It sounds like it's over. And guess what? You don't have to love each other as individuals. All you got to do is play together and prepare to maximize your contribution to the team. And believe me, you'll be okay.
Yeah, I have noticed there's been just way too much shifting. I think it's like every play, every batter, the shift is just on. I remember days where, Ray Ordonez would be able to graze across second and third and be able to get a play. Like, they're not letting these guys make the plays. No more flashy plays. Everything has to be by the book, by the standard, get the ground ball, throw it. Nothing flashy anymore to make us distinguish some of these players in the infield.
I think the one thing that, and again, I don't have any numbers to back this up, This is totally anecdotal, totally eye test. And the Cardinals series brought it to light. I felt like the Cardinals series, it just felt like there was more ground balls where a second baseman should have been, more ground balls where a shortstop has been, third baseman that went into the outfield. Now, I'm not counting the times where there's a ground ball up the middle and the shortstop's standing right there and they step on second to move over. I'm not saying that there's not a value to shifting, but I also know that if you're a second baseman and you're positioned on the grass or you're positioned somewhere up the middle and you got to move to your right, or your right, it's a lot tougher play than you normally. The shortstop, I think it was on Saturday, Lindor had to take a circuitous route to his right to get to a ground ball that turned out to be an infield hit. You got to think about the instincts of the position that you've grown up playing. You're actually taking them out of their normal flow and you're putting them in an unfamiliar spot on the field. They're not probably practicing either at. When you take ground balls, you're taking traditional ground balls at shortstop. Maybe that's something they look at. I'm not the expert, and I could be completely wrong, and I have no numbers to indicate what the impact is. I do know, and speaking to over the weekend somebody who's a scout for a National League club, that he has said he's been in organizational meetings where they have the kind of rhetoric that says, hey, if we had done this defensive positioning X number of times, you would have saved this many runs, which would have led to this many wins. Well, yes, you can do that formula, but that formula is a macro formula, all-encompassing. Every situation is different. You have no idea when you take a bundle or a bulk of stats how to translate that to wins, because those runs saved in that game could be a lot different than runs saved in another game. You have no idea. But they're going to go off of that, so they become somewhat of a slave, for lack of a better word, to these numbers. And if you don't follow that edict, the front office is going to be pissed at you as a manager. And guess what? If you don't follow that edict in the modern game, you'll start getting criticized by the advanced analytics and the media. Because that's what they have now. They have numbers to report on. And you don't want to be on the wrong side of that because you could lose your job or look bad within the industry. It's as much about politics, I think, as it is about winning ball games, unfortunately.
Once again, I'm here with Mike Silva, host of the Talkin' Mets podcast. That's Talkin' with no G. Speaking about firings, last week when I posted my show, about a few hours later, Chili Davis and Tom Slater were fired as the hitting coach and the assistant hitting coach, respectively. Hugh Quattlebaum and Kevin Howard were hired. The offense has been struggling all year with runners in scoring position. The same happened last year. Do you feel it was the right time to let Chili and Tom go?
I think ultimately that was what was going to happen, hook or by crook. I think they wanted that to happen in the offseason, and they used a opportunity where it was hard to criticize to do it. I think he accomplished a couple of things. Here's from a standpoint of an organization where I think it's the right time. It's the right time because you didn't want the guy in there anyway. It's a hitting coach. It's a window dressing move. It's going to have very little impact on wins and losses. And it sends a message to the club to wake them up, saying, hey, don't get too comfortable. We'll send people packing around here. Now, whether that included the manager who supported his coaches and didn't want them fired remains to be seen. He doesn't have a contract for next year. But if I were him, it just goes to show you that these guys will make a change. It empowers Zach Scott, an interim GM, that's trying to put his imprint on the organization, trying to wrest control because he wants to keep, his position. He doesn't want to go back to being a cabinet member or out of the organization. So from a standpoint of the people in charge, it was the perfect time. Do I think it's going to mount to a hill of beans? Look, I've talked to former players. They don't necessarily need the hitting coach. They're there for them. If they want to use them, they can use them. Some of them don't go to them for games or weeks. Some of them have their own people. Derek Jeter used to go to Rick Down. He never used to go to his own. He didn't go to Kevin Long when he was the hitting coach. Derek Jeter went to his own guy. So I think it'll help certain players, and they're a resource, just like anything else. Coach is a resource. But whether or not you use him depends on who you are. And for the most part, the veterans like a Lindor, they don't have to use him. What are you going to do? You're going to release Lindor? Now, you start getting into the guys up and down the organization as they try to make it to the big leagues. That's different. But those are more minor league guys, hitting coordinators and things like that. That's what those guys were. Now they're on the big league club, basically a placeholder. To me, it's going to have very little difference. And, the fact that they've been averaging 5 runs a game for the most part since Chili left has nothing to do with Hugh Quattlebaum, who I think I think Kevin Kernan over at Ball 9 wrote a very interesting piece how Hugh Quattlebaum is trying to incorporate a more traditional style of hitting along with launch angle into his philosophy. But, I'll be honest, Chili Davis, line-to-line, line drive approach, I think is an art form lost, and I think he did a nice job with Pete Alonso. I think, Pete certainly speaks highly of him. Other players had big years under him, whether they used them or not I don't know that for a fact. A professional like that played in the big leagues for 2 decades, that's somebody that I think has something to offer. But unfortunately, in this day and age where you have to be more analytically inclined, more computer-driven, more modern, that's going to be tough for those kind of guys to stick around on a coaching staff. They're becoming dinosaurs, for lack of a better word.
Now, even though they are on a 5-game winning streak, it still doesn't feel like this offense is right at all. I brought this up last week, but if they don't fully get on track here with the offense and runners in scoring position, do you think there could be significant changes to the lineup come next year or even maybe by the trading deadline? I thought that, like you said, putting this all on Chili, eventually these guys are going to have to hit on their own. So maybe the right mix for this lineup is not set yet.
Yeah, I think it would be hard. If McNeil has a bad year, Lindor has a bad year, and Dom has a bad year, it's going to be hard to replace all 3 of those guys. I worry a little bit about McNeil getting a little too home run happy. This Dom's off to a slow start, but it's too soon for me to really say that, because the only thing you can do this year is that if the pitching continues to be as good as it has been, both bullpen and starters, and you're able to manufacture enough runs. Right now, the way the pitching is, if you average 4.5 runs a game, which, is more leaning towards 4 runs than 5 runs, I thought this was a team that would be more of a 5-run average and be a bit of a bully offense, knock out mediocre pitchers. They're not been that. They're more of a team that, could hit a little bit better against mediocre pitchers, but struggles in general against any good arm. You could still win a lot of games. It'll be almost the exact opposite of 2019 when they had a good offense, the bullpen stunk, and they were able to eke out 86 wins. You may have to do the opposite, where the pitcher's got to be really, really good, and you got to outpitch to win. So I think it's early to really say that, but ultimately, can they make a big trade midseason? They have some very interesting prospects that I think are going to be in demand. Already, you heard over the offseason Francisco Alvarez's name come up.
Yeah.
Ronnie Mauricio. I think at the lower levels of the Mets system, they have some very promising prospects. And the temptation to trade those guys to win this year will exist. And the key is, who are the players, if you do trade them, who would those players be? And can you acquire those same players without giving up your jewels? And that might be the real conversation that we get into if they need a bat. If an extra bat, a Chris Bryant on a walk year becomes available, and you're like, I need to inject some life into this offense. I need this guy. Who can you give to get that guy? Do you have to give up a big bat? Probably not for Chris Bryant because he's a free agent, but somebody of that ilk. What does the other team ask for? Because everybody's going to try to be the next Jared Kelenic for Robinson Cano and Edwin Diaz deal. They're going to want that. So I think we're a little early to say that, but certainly Dom Smith is one guy I'm looking at because the history isn't that long in terms of offensive success. I'm a little worried about McNeil's swing being longer, even though he's not striking out. I think Lindor, realistically, we could expect the very good Lindor, not the elite Lindor. I think we debated whether that was the guy you were getting anyway. And, James McCann is there more for defense than offense, and I'm not really going to worry too much about him, but certainly you expected more than what you got out of him so far. And remember, you also don't have Nimmo and J.D. Davis in the lineup right now. And it would be interesting to see those guys in there when all these other guys get on track. Maybe it's a little too soon for us to make judgments, but 30 games is still long enough for us to say, maybe the offense is something that we have to reevaluate. Maybe it's not as good as we thought it would be.
Now, we can't end this interview without getting into a huge positive takeaway from the Mets so far this season. The bullpen has been outstanding, especially this week with the workload they've had to take on, the 2 bullpen games and all. 2-part question for you. How impressed are you with the bullpen, and who has impressed you the most coming out of the pen?
Well, I've been very critical of the Mets bullpen for a long time. I said before the season started that maybe it's been 15 years since they had a good bullpen. Last good bullpen was 2006, and then the only bullpen I could think that I had some confidence in was the Addison Reed Familia bullpen of 2016 and 2017, and that was more of 8-9. You was a little dicey in 6 and 7 if your starters got knocked out early. But in general, I think you got to love what you see out of Trevor May. The one big surprise, and the guy that, if you want to say surprised or impressed, Jeurys Familia is starting to look like vintage Jeurys Familia. Maybe not completely, but I don't know if it was that Bryce Harper at bat where he got the big out after the near home run by Hoskins, or that he's finally found his arm slot or that Hefner has worked magic with him, but he's always thrown hard, but he's getting ahead of the hitter. And that was what was missing for so long, because once he gets ahead of the hitter, that sinker slider, they're going to have to chase that. They can't lay off that. When it's a 2-0 count, they don't have to hit that. So, and then of course, Castro and whatnot. That's been, I think, the one guy that has learned how to pitch, and a guy that I expected to maybe make a contribution in the 6th inning, but he's been good enough now that he's cut his walks down where you can honestly say he's another guy that you could count on in late innings. So, Loop and what he's done, you got so many options. And then the guys that have filled in, Reed Foley, Barnes, who I dumped on all off season, might be the first reclamation project under this new regime. You really have had, and other than Stephen Tarpley, everybody has kind of been best case scenario, if you could say. So you have to feel really good about it.
Well, Mike, before we wrap up, let everyone know where they can interact with you on social media and find your podcast.
So at Mike Silva Media on Twitter. You go to talkametspodcast.com and it'll take you to the Apple Podcast and subscribe. No G, as you've said. And, I'm on Apple Podcasts, Spotify. If you Google Talking Mets Podcast, there's not a podcast service. It's free. It's a weekly podcast. I do come to everybody with, shorts, during times of news like the Chili Davis firing and things like that. Fortunately, I don't have to do a short about Jacob deGrom being out for the year, so that's good. And then, of course, from time to time, I interact with, guys like you who it's so nice to see after a long doldrum of barren Mets content that I think Steve Cohen has energized the fan base, young guys like you who are trying to get into independent media. And hopefully we get more coverage, more positive and not fanboy coverage, but more positive, productive coverage than maybe we've gotten throughout the years. And I'm glad to see that, guys like you are kind of, getting back into it. Because if you think back, a lot of the blogs that were around back during the, Omar Minaya years, they're gone.
Yep.
So now podcasting is a thing, and hopefully there's good quality podcasts. And I think with analytics and with information, I think all of us are better poised to get better content. And there's no shortage of fans that want it. So I'm happy to have been on this, and thank you so much for having me.
I can't thank you enough, Mike, for coming on. I really appreciate this, and I hope that we can do this again sometime soon.
Call me anytime, Anthony. I appreciate it. Thanks, man.
That was Mike Silva, host of the Talkin' Mets podcast. That's Talkin' with no G. So when you search for the Talkin' Mets podcast, make sure that you take that G right on out of there, and you'll find it, like he said, on Apple Podcasts, and you can follow him at Mike Silva Media. So thanks again, Mike. We appreciate you, and we will have you on again. Final thoughts before this train leaves the station. With all that has gone on this past week, it doesn't feel like the Mets have won 5 games in a row, but they have, with great pitching, especially out of the bullpen. Hitting this past weekend from Jeff McNeil and Francisco Lindor, who seems to finally be waking up. What's most important is they are scoring runs the way you should. Not by blasting home runs all the time, but by small ball, station to station, sacrifice flies. Any way you can get the runs in, the Mets should be doing. And they did that this weekend against the Arizona Diamondbacks. And it's a good thing to see. That's what you want to see. Now, the Mets are 16-13, 3 games over 500, and haven't even come together on all cylinders yet. They're in first place, a game up on the Phillies, 7-3 in their last 10 games. So far this season, 9-4 at home, 7-9 on the road, so they're going to have to work on winning some games on the road. Changing courses a little bit here. Willie Mays celebrated his 90th birthday this past week. He played for the New York and San Francisco Giants for 21 years, from 1951 to 1972, before he was traded to the New York Mets from 72 to 73, part of the You Gotta Believe Mets that went to the World Series in 1973, just falling 1 game short. His career batting average with the Mets, he was .238, 14 home runs, 44 RBIs between both seasons. It was kind of the end of the era for Willie Mays, but it was nice to see him come home to New York. I know a lot of fans were really happy to have him back in New York. Joan Payson, happy to have him in New York. And, he won a World Series with the New York Giants in 1954, where he made the infamous The Catch in Game 1 at the Polo Grounds. Just looking at his career, Hall of Famer, 2-time MVP, Rookie of the Year, 12 Gold Gloves, 2-time All-Star MVP. Now, I bring up Willie Mays. Obviously, it was his birthday. He turned 90. He looks great. I don't know if you saw him in San Francisco. They were celebrating him, driving him around in that cool car. But he looks great, smiling, waving at everybody. Now, I'm wondering, and I want to know your thoughts on this, should the Mets retire his number? I know he was only a Met for a season and a half, but should they retire his number? So many contributions he made, not just for the Mets, but in New York baseball. All those years he played for the New York Giants at the Polo Grounds. Maybe it would be a retiring kind of like how they did Jackie Robinson and what Jackie Robinson meant to baseball and New York baseball. Could Willie Mays get some sort of the same treatment? That's what I want to know from you guys. I think it would be a good thing to do a Willie Mays. I know there's a lot of Mets numbers that need to be retired, but, Willie Mays being 90 years old, I would really like to see him one more time by the New York Mets. I think the last time we saw him was maybe the last game at Shea Stadium when they were honoring all the Mets of the past. So it would be nice at least to see him come in. Maybe they can retire his number, and well-deserved. What a career he had. One more note, and that is that Matt Harvey makes his return to Citi Field to face the Mets Wednesday as the Orioles take on the Mets at 12:10. Harvey's career as a Met, he was 34-37 with a 3.66 ERA. Now, it was never always a great time, but when Harvey first came out, he was supposed to be the man. Where deGrom is right now, we all thought that would have been Matt Harvey. I think deGrom wasn't even a thought at the time. It was Harvey, Syndergaard, Wheeler, even Rafael Montero. deGrom wasn't even a thought at the time, around 2013-14. And then after Matt Harvey had Tommy John, he came back for 2015, had a great 2015 season, went into the playoffs, pitched very well, had that really great Game 5 of the World Series where, he didn't want to come out, and then Terry Collins kept him in way too long, and, the Mets ended up losing that game. But I don't think as many people hate Matt Harvey as, one would think. I definitely don't. I enjoyed his time pitching here. I've went to a couple of his games. He pitched very well. I think that even if he were to come back at any point in time, that the Mets fans would have supported it. So Harvey is coming back Wednesday for the first time at Citi Field. I don't think he's going to get booed out of the stadium. I think fans are going to cheer him. And, a lot of Met fans that I see on Twitter have mostly been supportive of him and his comeback. So it should be a fun game on Wednesday. It's an early game, so you get to enjoy that. But Matt Harvey returning Wednesday at Citi Field. Now, as we wrap up this show, please take a few minutes to write me a review. Let me know what you think of the show, okay? You can go on Apple Podcasts, rate the show 1 to 5 stars. Hopefully it's 5 stars. Help me climb the rankings in the sports and baseball and Mets podcasts. And, the more you rate this show and review this show and give positive rating, positive reviews, the more ears get to be put on listening to this podcast. So I would really appreciate if you could take the time, write me a review, let me know what you think of the show, what you like, what you don't like. I want to make this show better each and every week for you Met fans out there. Now, you can follow the show on Twitter at Subway To Shea. Listen and subscribe to the show on Anchor.fm, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Radio Public, Breaker, and Pocket Cast. Turn on those notifications to never miss an episode of Subway To Shea. You can also find Subway To Shea on YouTube. This podcast is available on the HSP Network. Catch me alongside podcasts like The Bullpen with DA, Third Floor Lounge, which covers the NFL and NBA, Sus Talk, and the return of the High Spot Podcast, which covers all things professional wrestling. Just search High Spot Podcast on YouTube or youtube.com/High Spot Podcast and make sure to subscribe today. Well, that will do it for this week's podcast. Once again, a huge thank you to Mike Silva of the Talkin' Mets podcast. We're definitely going to have him on again. Always remember to listen, subscribe, share, and review. For Anthony Rivera, you've been listening to Subway To Shea. And always remember, let's go Mets.